a lot of new data sources that we have. So Eduardo mentioned things like social media. We work a lot with geospatial data because of the nexus between the environment and conflict, for example. And we're able to bring in a lot of different layers of data into a picture that could provide more nuance in terms of the factors and predictors of conflict. So I think it's complex. I know that there's a lot of efforts in member states and in international organizations to be able to intervene. And I think from a technical perspective, it definitely appears easier than from a political perspective. And I think one of our tasks here is also to try to see what might be possible on both fronts, and try to converge on methods that would work, or approaches that would work for both policymakers and for data scientists.
Thank you, Eleanor. I like how it's not non-trivial to shift from global governance to anticipatory governance. Okay, Peter, you have recently concluded a study using AI to understand linguistic differences in the media in high versus low peace societies. Can you tell us more about this work?
Yes, very good. Yes, and also thank you everyone for being here this morning, and Jo Marie for inviting me, and Do for organizing this. I feel like saying it's now for something completely different, because I want to talk about peace, not conflict prevention or conflict resolution. I want to talk about peace and trying to understand peace. And it's a different topic with different drivers, and it's something that's largely ignored. So I also want to have a full disclosure and say that thank you very much. I'm not an AI specialist. I'm not a data analyst in that way. But except the fact that I know that it's completely taken over my life. The higher education, publishing, communications, like everything is now AI affected, right? So we're swimming as fast as we can to figure this out. But we have been working on focusing on peace for a while now. The international community, as many of you know, has struggled for a long time, particularly the UN, to kind of return to its original mandate to sustain peace because of this, myriad crises, humanitarian crises, conflict, violent crises that need to be attended to, which take all the air out of the UN's, capacities. And so we've been trying to encourage a shift in orientation and facilitate that through use of data. This project, that Peace Could Talk, it's about in general, the whole thing is about a 10-year project, but I'm going to talk about one piece of it, which is the more recent data science AI methodologies that we've been using to understand peaceful societies, to try to take peaceful societies seriously. They're rarely studied, right? We study as humans, we study the things we fear, but the idea of studying, love, happiness, workflow, or peaceful societies is uncommon. We come to it late, but we're moving there. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about peace, because not only are there not peaceful societies, not only are they really understood, but the current indices that are used in the international community to kind of rank nations and societies are highly flawed. They're methodologically flawed. They're filled with biased assumptions. And so they're extremely problematic. And I've been in conversations with these folks and others for over a decade now about my concerns with using these kinds of ways of naming and shaming nations around peace if the data isn't good data, which in my view, it's not. So given that, we were critiquing them for about 10 years, we thought maybe we should try to offer some kind of an alternative, which is what we've been trying to do. This is a multidisciplinary group that's been working on it. I won't go into all their names, but basically what we're trying to do is take peace speech seriously. So we know that hate speech is used to predict and prevent violence, right? To understand patterns of violence and try to get in early as possible, oftentimes very localized language. But when we started to investigate this, we became aware of the fact that there was no peace speech identified. Like, are there differences in speech in high and low peace societies? And what could they be mean? How could they be used? What is the language of peace? So just to tell you the study we did, so we've now done a series of studies. I'll talk about a couple of them quickly, but we use these 5 sort of popular peace indices: the Global Peace Index, the Positive Peace Index, the World Happiness Index, Fragile States Index, and the Humanitarian Development Index, and basically averaged them to identify what they would claim would be the sort of high-low peace nations, right? By various definitions. They're all filled with their own kinds of assumptions. And then we use them to rank, and as you can see, some of the rankings are different, but basically we were able to identify, according to these average indices, 10 high peace and 10 low peace societies. So what we wanted to do is try to understand, if we scraped data from these societies, particularly from news accounts originating from these societies, but also on Twitter and some other social media platforms, if we were to look at the language, are there differences? So the first thing we did is we got a bunch of experts in peace and conflict and said, what do we think we'd see in the language? And we developed a peace lexicon, in addition to the conflict lexicons that exist, and we applied it, and it didn't work at all, right? It didn't tell us anything. So we said, okay, AI, machine learning, you tell us, are there differences, important differences between high and low peace societies? And lo and behold, there were, right? So the machine learning algorithm that we developed and worked with was able to classify news accounts from high or low peace societies at like 95 to 97%. So it was saying, yeah, there are some significant differences in the language that's being used in these societies, and then we had to kind of make sense of what they are, right? So that's what we've been doing. We've used different data sets, the News on the Web database, LexisNexis, 900 million articles from that, some X data in different places, and using machine learning and natural language processing. These are some of the word clouds that come from the high peace versus low peace societies. And so if you see on your left, the high peace language, and on your right, the low peace language. So these are frequency word clouds. These are the terms, and the size of the terms indicate the most frequent terms. And then this is what's called importance. This is an importance layer, which are the things that make the most difference in the algorithms between the two, right? So you may start to see that there are kind of fundamental differences here. But what they really are is the hard part now. So what we've done, or in the process of doing right now, are vetting our understanding of what the differences are linguistically with local, particularly journalists and editors and publishers who work in these societies. So we have a series of these workshops where we bring them together and show them these word clouds and say, this is what we got from your reporting in your society. Why? What does it mean? How do we understand it? What's important? Because we can understand, I see some significant differences, but again, I bring my own biases. So we want to make sure that the locals have input into our interpretation and understanding what this is. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but what I do want to say is, when we ran this study with this algorithm, what we were able to do is basically, based on these indices, the 5 indices, and based on our algorithm, we took high and low peace society language, and then we took societies in the middle, right? So who weren't part of the training of the database, and we said, can you rank these? And it accurately ranked those. So in other words, we were able to do what all of these indices combined do with data that could be available to us in real time, right? Think about it. Every day on the internet, there is news and reporting and social media. So there's this flow of information. One of the challenges with many of these indices is there's a lag. There are oftentimes 2 years ago that the data was collected and then analyzed and it came out in a report. So, you know, we're behind the queue. This could allow us the capacity to, in real time, scrape data from societies and make sense. So that's what we're kind of currently doing, is we're working with AI and humans to make sense of these. We've used chat to help us identify the underlying themes that exist in high and low peace societies, as well as humans like journalists and others from these nations. And Toyota, I don't know if you know this, but Toyota's mandate, Toyota, the automobile company, their mandate is happiness, right? They want to promote a happy society, which I'm all for. And they agreed to fund us. So they funded us for a few years to basically continue to study this, make sure that we have sound findings, but ultimately to build a dashboard. And the idea is that we would be able to provide, again, real-time analyses of shifts in language, measuring both conflict speech and hate speech, and see if the proportion starts to shift in a way that is ultimately predictive of stability, political stability or not. One of the things we do know from the study of highly peaceful societies is when they usually get there, it's very rare that they slip back into violence, right? There are violent societies that move into negative peace and stabilize there, but moving from negative peace to sort of warm peace or sustainable peace is a very different phenomenon. We don't understand it, but what we do know is that they tend to be much more robust societies, even when shocks hit them. So we're trying to understand that, and I probably said enough for this panel, so I'll stop there.
No, that's fascinating. I'm intrigued how in the word cloud for conflict societies, we just have state. And on the peaceful societies, we have think, look, play, and home. That's quite telling. Very well. Paige, your book talks about the Views project based in Uppsala that forecasts conflict. What is it about? What are the aspirations and limitations of this tool, especially for diplomats?
Oh, wow. Okay, great. I want to say, first of all, that we talk about, we reference your work in the book as, really one of the promising kind of future avenues. And it's at the end of the chapter on conflict forecasting. So we're also, really, a +1 on this pivot to looking at peace systems and peacefulness. Oh, good. Well, my work is done. So let's talk a little bit more about forecasting, and we can do that through one of the particular models that is probably one of the most talked about models that we have right now. That's open source. Of course, there are a lot of governments and private sector that are developing conflict forecasting, political risk models. We don't have access to those, and we don't really know what they're doing. So what we can talk about is what we do have access to, and those are more open source public models, usually driven by academia. And so Views is the Violence and Impacts Early Warning System. It's run out of the University of Uppsala in Sweden and in collaboration with PRIO. To back up a little bit, again, forecasting is nothing new. Humans have been doing forecasting, right? People have used statistical models to try to do forecasting for decades. Over the last 10 years or so, people have been building in machine language, natural language processing in different stages of forecasting to do different things. First of all, to convert text to data that can be used in models. How do you convert a massive amount of news articles into data that you can feed into a model? That's something that natural language processing can help with. But also, more recently, using more advanced techniques like random forest algorithms to really go through much larger data sets. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But places like the Carter Center have used machine language, natural language processing, I should say, to create classifications in data, in order to track conflict dynamics in Syria. ACLED has used it to classify different types of social protests around the world to understand where are social protests rising or where is it falling. But this is forecasting conflict is an inherently difficult challenge. There's different factors involved. We know there are kind of long-term structural factors, things like governance, things like inequality, things like levels of trust in a society. They're all different, drivers that are longer term and structural. But understanding those aren't going to tell you when a society is going to tip into conflict. Like what will precipitate that That's more the dynamic factors. That's about rising social protest. It could be the death of a leader. Could be, things that are, it could be information that leaders have that we're not privy to. So it's very difficult to have access to that. So there are dynamic factors as well. And I think why views is interesting is because it's one of the first models that's really trying to combine both of those. So what views does is it takes data from hundreds of different data points, from governance, from battle-related deaths to development indicators, and they're drawn from trusted data. So they're not using big data like the internet. They're using vetted, trusted data sources. And then what they're doing is they're taking a piece of that data that relates to past conflicts, and they're trying to understand for a set of countries, what were the drivers that were linked to the eruption of conflict in the past? What does this model tell us about that? And they have some advanced techniques that they're using to do that. Again, random forest is, I don't know if I should go into it. It's like matrix math. It's beyond most of our math capabilities in this room. But it's really looking at, if you imagine having 200 data indicators kind of up here and 200 down here, it's literally looking at a one-to-one kind of relationship with all of them, like through a big network. And it's, running essentially, trying to find correlations between that for past conflicts. And then it's using that to predict the probability of future conflict. So it's looking at a 1 to 36 month timeline. It's much more accurate, and I'll talk about what accurate means here later, but it's much more accurate in the shorter term than it is 36 months out, which is understandable. And it really is much more accurate for countries that are already in conflict, not for peaceful countries tipping into conflict. And then I would say a third element I think that's interesting about it is that it is also it shows kind of a risk, but it's static. So it's not showing rapidly escalating risk. I'll give you an example of that. So let's say end of 2020, Ethiopia, which we know kind of rapidly escalated into conflict. Their model would have shown Ethiopia as at high risk, but a static risk. It wouldn't have shown a rapidly escalating risk. And so there are a bunch of challenges there around data and lags in getting data. So you can't show rapidly escalating risk if your data sources only are refreshed once a year, right? Or even once a month. It may not be possible to do that. So I think where views is really helpful so far is in the short term, understanding which countries are at risk. I think that it's getting better. It's getting better, really every 6 months. I think they are really working on the problem of of conflict precipitation actively. But I do think that there just is an inherent challenge in that tipping point question that it could be we need to accept. Some people talk about the prediction of conflicts as more like the prediction of cloud formation rather than like how clocks function. So this is not physics, right? It's something quite different. And we can't right now predict when a cloud is going to form in the sky. So why don't I leave it at that, and we can discuss some of the more, pros and cons later.
Yes, that's very helpful. In fact, let's move to the cons. Eleanor, are we overestimating the power of AI to understand, diagnose, predict? What are the risks of AI-powered anticipation technologies?
Thank you very much for that question. I think we live in a world right now where we're very either or with AI. So this question has been asked so many times, is AI going to kill us all, or is it going to save us? Which one is it, And actually, when you work as a data scientist, it's just a methodology. And it's just going into the data and trying to find the right solution. It's not magic, And so we've talked a little bit about really good applications of AI, and I don't think we should throw them out. particularly analyzing data is extremely valuable. So I'm going to talk about random forest for just 1 second more. When I did my master's degree, it was pre-data science days, and I was interested in looking at deliberative quality. So when different either politicians or even citizens had deliberations, could we score them in terms of the quality of their deliberations? So there's research on that, and I found it was amazing. When I did it for my master's, I manually coded 6,000 speech, which many people I think here have probably done as well. And then I had a researcher who did a subsection of that to get an intercoder reliability score, which was 65%, so very low. And we were actually pretty unreliable in terms of manually coding all these speeches. So for my PhD, we did this with machine learning. So we did 200,000 speeches and trained an algorithm to be able to give predictive scores. And then we did the intercoder reliability with humans, right? And just to try to see. So this is a use case which could be very applicable in peace context, because there's a lot of interest in analyzing speech and analyzing text and analyzing peace building deliberative contexts. This is a use case where AI is very, very, very helpful. And without AI, actually, it's almost impossible to do when you have not just 200,000 speeches, but you have millions of speeches or comments and so on. You can't do it manually. It's not possible. That being said, I think we are in a techno-solutionist era where there's a lot of talk about how AI can do absolutely everything and replace every function. And I think if we take these techniques really from a methodological perspective, we should move towards thinking about this and the potential of hybrid methods simply. I think that there's enormous amount of value in qualitative methods, in interviews, in being in the field, in understanding context, all kinds of things like that. And we're constantly hit by that in a way with the challenges that we have with AI at the moment, because these social science methods are not taken into account when we're building these new technologies. And so you see this constantly with the new latest tools that end up doing things that are completely inappropriate because they haven't been taken as a methodological tool that should be tested also in a societal context, et cetera, but as a sort of blanket magical thing that will do everything that we need. And so I would really say that for me, the big risk is really buying into the hype. I think it's, again, we should harness AI always with a sense of perspective and a sense of nuance. It's easy, even having worked in AI, it's easy to almost have a feeling of panic with all these new tools coming out, and they seem to be doing all these kinds of things. And how do we have to use them? We have to use them quickly and so on. But I really kind of urge a slow, more analytical perspective and keeping in mind the other types of methodologies that we all have. And I think that's what I would say. And hopefully that can start translating more into the ethics and governance space, where we can have better safeguards and better political and societal understanding of the effects of these tools.
So a fusion between the social science and the data science. Yes, I think that's key. This state of incommunicado between the two is something I don't understand. Peter, back to you. In your experience, what are some of the pitfalls of using these technologies, particularly around things like taxonomies?
Well, I guess, I would echo some of the previous concerns that have been addressed. I think my biggest concern, I guess, about AI or the power of these data science tools in general is the weaponization of these ideas. That we could, we are learning things that are powerful. These are extremely powerful tools. And I know that as we start to share our findings with some of our colleagues, they say, we're concerned about this because it could easily, so if you can learn in a society the difference between peace speech and hate speech, you can use that insight, right, to kind of flood the internet with information. I was in Bogota this week. Is anyone from Colombia here? Yes. Oh, hi. How are you? Good to see you. So Colombia is in a precarious place, and I was working with data scientists there who have used data science as a proactive intervention around polarization and social unrest. So the social unrest that was happening in 2021, particularly in Cali, where there were blockades and violence, and they were monitoring social media and seeing the extreme polarization that was happening and the weaponization of social media to attack the other side. But they were also able to use that data to first of all identify in Cali, in the city, the hotspots of the violence. There were two particular places where most of the violence took place. And then they sort of had a bold strategy, which is a combination of social science or maybe just human relations and data science. But a group of business leaders went into these spaces and met with the protesters and walked with them and worked with them locally and started to understand what is this about for you? What are your major grievances? And from the insights they gained from kind of real on the ground work in these hotspots, they were able to identify that, principally what they were talking about is just a pure lack of opportunity. These were mostly young men who just couldn't get there, and they were furious. And so what they started to do is basically they hacked social media by offering opportunities in the space for work that were genuinely coming from the mayor of Cali. And so in combination with the government and social media data analysts and the business sector, they also identified local actors that were doing good work around economic needs and offering job support. And together, they changed the social media discourse by offering this third attractor, I would say, this third pattern that got a lot of attention. And suddenly, that was the main narrative on social media. And it led to a kind of de-escalation. And so I don't know if I'm getting to the problems with categories, but what I wanted to say is that, to me, the biggest problem is weaponization of these tools. And yet they can also be used to disrupt that type of weaponization if you work with local people and understand their needs.
And so many interesting examples coming from the global south that we can learn from. Paige, what is the future trend? What do you see as on the horizon in the next 5-10 years in terms of these technologies?
I don't know. I don't think any of us know. I tell people, about the book. Our deadline for delivering the book was in December of 2022. If we had actually finished writing the book and delivered it in 2022 in December, we would have missed all the evolution around large language models. So you would be having a book about AI for peace that doesn't really mention ChatGPT and GPT-4, which has really revolutionized our public discourse about AI. When we first started out with this project that we were working on, me and my co-author, there were things called chatbots. Remember chatbots? They're kind of these very cute, clunky things. We didn't think that they were really going anywhere. So I will say that I do think that obviously the tools are going to continue to evolve. I do think in terms of trends, we do see a trend, really led by the EU in terms of regulation, really understanding risks of AI and putting in place guardrails around different types of uses of AIs, depending on level of risk. And that we'll hopefully see that more of a I'm not sure this will be a trend. This is what I hope will be a trend, is more participation and recognition of the Global South in these debates about AI regulation and AI ethics. because, AI is everywhere now, and it is impacting everybody around the globe. It's impacting the way people do law. It's impacting the way they do work. It's impacting the way we do medicine. So it is something that requires the entire world to participate in setting kind of the international agenda for that. And then I think, because we're talking about governance, and I think the other thing that I would hope to see, I'm not sure that I will see it, is more kind of local ownership of these types of forecasting initiatives. Because I think that one of the big challenges with adopting new insights is that people and countries feel like these are labels that are being put on us, usually by people in Europe and North America, because that is where the technology is right now. And they don't feel that they have participation or ownership about the insights that are being gained. And we talk about like the prevention agenda at the UN and the new agenda for peace. There's a focus there on national ownership of prevention strategies. Why couldn't this be part of that? How could we get there?
Thanks. Last question for Eleonore, and then we open the floor to questions. Eleonore, how do we assure that we maintain human agency in a world in which we have more and more AI tools helping us?
That's a really good and difficult question, for which I didn't prepare. I have been thinking a lot about this lately, about our intentionality in developing AI tools. And sometimes it does feel that we're developing AI tools that are replacing some of the things about being human that are the most enjoyable. For example, thinking, creating, those kinds of things. And I actually am wondering if we could take a step back and look more concretely at the indices that you mentioned, for example, happiness and indicators of well-being, and connect them with the development of AI tools and say, how could we use AI to enhance well-being? Are there specific tasks, like kind of going back, that really need help in terms of AI? And maybe this area of creativity, of deep thought and analysis of relationships is maybe not the best use of replacement. Because I heard someone say this recently. She said, do I need an AI to write poetry for me, or do I need an AI to do my laundry? And I think we're in the last couple of years, we've gone to the development of AI that really, that replaces everything that we enjoy so much about life. And so that's where I really want our agency to kind of come back, and for us to think about, let's shape the development of AI with more intentionality, and really think about where we would want to orient these companies, because the companies are coming and they're making money, and it's just like go, 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 anything goes, whatever space they'll fill. And I think it's us as academics to really think through, could we provide better guidelines in terms of, this is going to really enhance human well-being in societies all around the world. This is where you need to go. And maybe some of the things that we really like doing, you can leave for us, So that's how I would answer that.
I like the word intentionality. Very well. Let's turn it over to you. We have a microphone, and we'll start with the gentleman over there.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you. This has been an absolutely fascinating talk. My name is Lawrence Phillips. I'm with the Australian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My question is, when it comes to AI tools in peace and conflict analysis, to what extent is there a bias towards major languages? I ask this as I think of the case of Myanmar, where it's very linguistically diverse, and there could be a lot of applications of AI tools to be able to analyze the conflict and its dynamics and opportunities for peace building and such. But does this require the AI to be trained in the minority languages and the intricacies of that? And is this something that's happening? Is this something that companies have an interest in doing? Yeah, thank you.
let's take 3 questions, and then you can select who to answer.
Thank you very much. I'm Deputy Milad from China Mission to UN. And what impressed me most is your new mindset of predict the peaceful peaceful future of a country instead of the conflict, and which is very innovative for me. My question is, would you please give me 2 examples for the use of AI as tool to predict peace or conflict? One example is successful example. The other one is a failure. Thank you very much.
Can we take one more question?
Hi, I'm Diane from the Philippine Mission. I have a comment and 2 questions, but I think my second question is similar to my Chinese colleague already, so just related to that. My comment is that I think Eleanor for saying to shape AI with intentionality, and for Paige mentioning that the need for participation of the Global South in the governance. I just wanted to share that in my experience from the Philippines, we are not producing these technologies, but it was a very conscious effort for my DPR in Geneva, who was a disarmament expert as a junior officer, and now the head of UN office in Manila. We had to fight our way through leadership to say we want to be in emerging tech governance. But even internally for developing countries, it's a struggle because there are other existential issues that we have to deal with. So that's why it's even internally, it's not that easy. And then when we succeeded in UNGA 77, we convinced our president to deliver statements that the Philippines will prioritize governance for emerging technologies, including AI, outer space. So we got through that, and from that, we were able to hammer down to cabinet. The president said this, so we need support on this, this, and this. We succeeded, but when we are down to a region, we still struggle because we're the only voice in our region who wants to jump in on inputs on emerging tech governance, because again, they have other existential issues and other priorities. So I think maybe the private sector, maybe the academe can scare the Global South better. Maybe it will prod us to be more active in this. And sorry, that's my comment. And then to my question, Eleanor, do we have any I liked your deliberative quality quality paper that you made. I was wondering what was the application for this, because I was imagining when you described it, maybe it's also a tool for foreign policy creation. Truthfully, I don't know how strategic countries are, but it's very difficult to read, let's say, regional perspectives. But maybe AI can be used for us to also map out, let's say, responses we've done in the past as a country, and then also map out responses or speeches by members in our region. It's also a way for us to be more contentious on our foreign policy creation through this information. I was wondering if your deliberative quality study plays out to that. And then, do you have any use case models for predicting natural disasters? Or what about predicting conflict? Or is it more speculative at this point? And then, similar to the question of my Chinese colleague, I was wondering about the limitations of AI and conflict prevention, because the speaker, Julia Angwen, on Tuesday, when I was asking about, is AI being used more for developing, let's say, autonomous weapons or weapon system, or are we using it more for conflict prevention? And her answer was, the short answer was, AI is being used more applicable or more useful in a restrictive setting. So the message I got is that it's not that easy to use in conflict prevention because there's too many factors. It's not that restrictive, too many factors to consider in conflict prevention. That's why I think my Chinese colleague is very important when he wanted use cases. I also wanted to see use cases where it has succeeded and where it has failed, because maybe it's the limitation. Maybe governments should be looking at investing in AI applications that are going to be useful and just give up on other things which are beyond what AI can do or should remain to be relegated to humans? Thank you.
Thank you.
I can maybe start with this last question. Okay. Thank you very much for your questions. I wanted to take this question because we've done quite a bit of work with my team in Southeast Asia. And so your question related to the Philippines, I think, was interesting. Of course, I don't have as much insight as you might have. But one of the things I noticed about several countries in Southeast Asia, notably the Philippines, is that there's very interesting startup companies developing, harnessing different types of AI. So there's different angles. So one of them is making use of existing open source models and adapting them to the Philippines context. Another one is an organization called Connected Women, where the CEO, Gina Romero, has trained thousands of women in AI-related tasks. So they're not necessarily from start to finishing developing AI models, but they're part of the AI supply chain, which still requires a lot of human input. And they do a lot of things like translation into different languages. They do tagging and labeling of data sets and so on. And so I do think that there's an opportunity of thinking about AI more as in terms of the supply chain and life cycle instead of thinking one country or one company has to do every single step. There's also data collection, there's testing, there's monitoring, there's a lot of different places. And so I would say that as we go along, there are more and more countries that are maybe considered more middle income that are starting to engage in different parts of AI development for to harness its economic benefits. And I think it's important because it's important for AI tools to be developed also with societal and cultural considerations, and which is something that we've encountered a lot. In terms of the question on deliberative quality, it's very much something that I'm interested in exploring a lot more in the coming years. At the moment, these kinds of tools are used a lot in comparative politics context. So one of the applications, we've done a lot of different kinds of applications, and one of the applications was to look at Indigenous parliaments in the Canadian North and to see if a consensus-based parliament had different indicators of deliberative quality rather than a partisan-based parliament. And that was really interesting for us in terms of the way in which people communicate. In, for example, Nunavut, which is a consensus-based parliament based on the Inuit culture, was very different from the Yukon, which had more of a partisan, party-based culture in their parliament. So using these tools to understand deliberations and deliberations, including in international affairs, can be quite useful. One other area that I think is now possible with generative AI, and I'd like to explore, I think it's potentially risky, but also interesting, is to think about what makes a deliberation good and high quality, potentially having high amounts of participation, having a certain convergence into optimal outcomes and so on. And then what of these factors can be taken on by AI? So one very common feature of good deliberation is good moderation, right? Thank you. And so generative AI tools are becoming better at moderating. So they can make sure that everyone that should speak speaks. They can provide translation services. They can aggregate contributions and provide areas of convergence and divergence. And they can request that participants vote in these areas. So these are areas that I think would be really interesting to explore in the deliberative AI space.
Somehow I find it very exciting that my role right now as a moderator could be replaced by AI. Paige, perhaps you want to take the languages question, and maybe Peter, you can take the examples.
Yeah, I mean, these are really great comments and questions. Thank you so much. I mean, I think on the languages, it depends on which types of applications that you're looking at, and then the amount of resource that people have to really adapt to different languages. So I know obviously it was a big criticism of Facebook, not having tracked hate speech on its site in Myanmar. And then Facebook essentially being used to drive to fuel violence in that country. And it has since adapted significantly. There were technological challenges with tracking hate speech in Myanmar. The way that the language is represented on the site is through a Unicode language. And so there was a technical issue there. But, private sector has adapted and really tried to make strides. Those companies that are committed, like Facebook, who have integrity units and which have not been dismantled like at X. But in any case, so that's one set of issues. Large language models, for example, as I know, I think are largely trained on English so far. I was even, our colleague in China was just in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, and they told me that even in China, the large language models there are trained mainly on English language text, which I don't know if that was true or not. That was what I was told. So that's another set of issues. Now, for the conflict forecasting, you have to open up every single data set that they are using, whether it's ACLED. I mean, ACLED is, based on news sources and others. I won't go into all of the different data sets, but, they are drawing from national statistical bodies, so that the language wouldn't be an issue there. They're drawing from World Bank indicators. So there's a lot of different varieties of data there that I would assume they would argue, irons out any bias that may be coming from some of the data sets if there's a language issue. So it's a complex answer to a great question. And I also wanted to just weigh in on this issue of practical uses. We could have had a whole panel just on practical uses, but we were talking about conflict forecasting. There's so many, really interesting uses. I can just highlight a few. I think people really know about HALA systems, which was operating in Syria and which was using AI methods to, in real time, they had an app that people could download on their phones in Syria while the war was really active. And when there were bombing runs overhead, where they could record the sound of a plane, upload it to HALA, and detect in real time whether this was likely a bomber, and so that they could move out of harm's way. So there's the kind of more ground up early warning stuff where there are real applications that people have used, and I could talk about even more examples like that. There's also examples in peace mediation. There's examples in using AI to, better comb through satellite imagery to monitor ceasefires. There's just a lot. Thanks very much.
I'll just add a couple of things, I guess. So in our research, we're completely guilty of just using English language to start. We needed to start somewhere, and that's what we're fluent in. However, I think our attempt to offer a check on that is working with local people, in each society where we're scraping data in order to check our assumptions, check our interpretations. So that's the best we've been able to do, although our interest is in expanding in other languages as we move forward. But again, it's also slow and demanding and expensive. And that gets to another question that someone raised about, is more money going, is more AI going into, I guess, defense or peace? AI, I think, is going where the money is, right? And that's, so I was at the Aspen Festival last summer, and they were talking about AI, and it was all about drones, right? And the value of drones and warfare. And so again, it's a crisis. It's something that feels urgent, and so that's where the attention goes, and that's where the money goes. And so the kind of stuff that we're doing is, thank you, Toyota, for being interested in the long run in peace. I do want to say, though, just one positive use case that a colleague of mine did, which uses a different kind of data, which isn't language data, it's images. And they were running a study on predicting political instability around the world. And they downloaded, I believe it was 900 million images over a period of time. And they were interested to see if there was some aspect of each of these images that could predict political instability or stability. And they were able to actually find a classifier that worked pretty well, like in the high 90s% prediction. And it was the presence or absence of a smile, right? So it's in some ways a very simple human thing, right? It was like, it was the presence or absence of a smile in a community that would predict political stability, right? So in some ways, you know, I mean, again, that's kind of like, of course, right? But it is a form of data that is more universal, and it's a form of expression that is more universal. And so there are sources of data that we can use that can sort of cut across these biases that we have built into our methods.
Love that. The takeaway, smile more. So you had your hand up earlier. Let's get another set of three.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I do want to echo my colleagues' appreciation for this panel. So important. So I'm glad we had that today. I'm Sarah from the Danish mission. You've touched on this a little bit, so I'd just be interested in hearing a bit more. We had this very interesting mediation simulation earlier in the week, and lots of challenges around that, of course. Eleonore, you talked about convergences and divergences, and Paige, you also talked about applications in the mediation space. So just be curious to see both in the format of mediation, but also in finding agreements, if this has been, if AI has been used to help there. And then we've talked about climate aspects of conflict, but I wonder also about women's role in conflict. Obviously, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is central here. So I can see this, and I've seen studies identifying this going in different directions, both in terms of exclusion, inclusion, violence against women, of course, but just be interested in your take on how these new technologies are shaping that space. Thank you so much.
We have one over here.
Thanks so much. I'm Elena from the UN Secretariat. And my question is on Peter's research in terms of language for peace. I mean, we saw, as you have mentioned, we saw, you know, home and think, etc. on the peace side, and then we have a lot of state-related issues on the other side. But my question is it the result or, you know, or the cause, basically? And for example, if you have looked at, or if you're planning to look at, how this changes when a country transitions from peace to conflict or from conflict to peace, you know, and I'm thinking about Ukraine, let's say pre, you know, February 2022, or even pre-2014, or Colombia, you know, post 2016, and you know how this has changed, and is language being used also to prepare a country for a war or for peace?
There's a gentleman over there.
About the global south, of the south of Manhattan. Thank you very much, and good morning. I'm Mohammed. I'm from the Embassy of Egypt in Moscow. First of all, I want to really thank the panel, because I think this is the first panel that talks about the use of AI in peace rather than in conflict, and the military use of AI. So it's been incredibly useful for me. My question is, to what extent does AI take into account or filters mis or disinformation when using data to provide results? And how is it, or could it be adapted to take into account context, specificities, and certain aspects or drivers that have a direct bearing on the conflict or possibility of a conflict occurring? I'm thinking of culture or cultural aspects, or ethnical, tribal, religious aspects. For example, which are drivers of conflicts in many places around the world, including, for example, in Africa, which is most obvious. Thank you.
Thank you. I suspect this will be the last round of questions. So if anybody has a question they want to squeeze in. Okay.
Good morning. Thank you. This was really fascinating. My name is Paul from the UN. I have a quick question for Professor Coleman on the peace talks. And sorry if I missed that, but what data sources do you use to collect your data? And on Views, the Views software, I think this is probably already used by the UN and could be really useful for us. On the question of identifying the tipping points, human intelligence or analysis can probably be really useful to identify these tipping points. So are there examples of predictive models that integrate real-time human information in the models? Thank you.
So much, Giulio from UN Secretariat. Super short question. We see AI is really enabling a collection of new data, from like monitoring satellite imagery to coding speeches. What sources of data are you most excited for your peace or conflict work in the future that AI will enable collection of?
Out there to unpack. Maybe we can start with Paige and move this way.
Okay, so Sarah, you probably know as much as we do about maybe what's happening with mediation and AI. I don't know how much you're tracking what's happening with in the UN and also in Geneva with that. Of course, there's the innovation cell within DPPA that has been producing this kind of tool. And I can just explain briefly what it is. It's, if you think of the idea, the very difficult task of being a mediator in conflict, and really trying to understand not just what's happening at the elite level, but how would certain proposals be received by a larger population and within different pockets of a larger population, what tools do we have to get at that? And so their thought was, why don't we comb public-facing social media pages? Again, we're looking at text, and we're looking only at things that are public, not looking at things that are private, probably where the real things are said, right? But we don't have access to private things on social media. So looking at what's public, and then to use AI-driven technologies to understand, okay, what are the patterns? What is the speech that's emerging around different types of proposals or initiatives? And then be able to feed that up into a mediation process. So I don't know I'm just going to be honest, I don't know the extent to which that has been helpful. But it would be, and I don't know of studies that have emerged yet to look at that. So I think that's a kind of next phase of, really understanding the practical application of it. And if it's, more of a kind of solutionism approach that nobody was asking for, I'm not sure. And then I wanted to also talk about the issue of taking into account misinformation and disinformation to deliver results. Is AI doing that? It's one of the reasons why when it comes to forecasting, models are not drawing on kind of really big data, stuff coming from the internet, data coming from social media, because you can't trust that information, and you can't turn it into usable data. Data scientists have this very useful phrase. It's called garbage in, garbage out. So if the data that you're putting into your system is not good, you're not going to get good results. And so they really are using smaller data sets that are trusted, that are vetted. Again, it's things like the World Bank development indicators. It's things vetted, data coming from national statistical bodies from around the world. It's their own data that they've developed on battle-related deaths. That is the thing that they are tracking in different countries around the world. So I think that is, I think you put your finger on a really important challenge. And then I think there was also a question about human intelligence and, isn't there a role for that, with these forecasting systems? I think certainly right now, none of the people doing forecasting think that what they have is valuable without humans looking at it and interpreting it. And it's not the intention of anyone I know to supplant human judgment and intelligence. The idea is to give an additional valid data point for decision making. And so then the question becomes, what's that interface between the data source itself what's the political interface between the data source and between decision making? And that's where, as we all know, there's been a breakdown. I think there are some good models for organizations that have done that in the past. I think ECOWAS, I could go into this, but we don't have time. ECOWAS has an interesting model. But I think it is a perennial challenge, is the political use of this information. Thank you.
So very quickly then, Sarah. So on the WPS agenda and AI, we actually have a report with UN Women that came out last week. So I'm happy to send it to you. It's called AI and the WPS. And so it uses a lot of the examples from Southeast Asia. So it answers all those questions. And so I won't give you an overview. I was going to give you an overview, but I won't. In terms, I wanted to just touch a little bit on what you said about mis and disinformation. We actually did another study with Eduardo recently, where we really found that a lot of the countering misinformation and disinformation, notably in our case study countries in sub-Saharan Africa, were done by journalistic fact checkers. And that really shocked me, because that seemed like so much work with very underfunded, very courageous people, with the volume of information that they're receiving, and they're going through the journalistic fact checking steps and verifying each source of information and then publishing the outcome. So to me, it's not a question of replacing them with AI, it's a question of funding them and then giving them AI tools to support their work. And I think that will be really important. The question of addressing misinformation, even using AI, is very complex. So you can't just say, oh, AI will do it, no problem. But I think we really need to start investing in that, and also empowering those that have the competencies to really address it. And that's where I think organizations like Congo Check or Africa Check are doing a lot. And so that's a really interesting area to explore. My last very brief point is on new sources of data. So I think we're going to have a new source of data very soon. And hopefully we work very hard on ethics and governance on that. And that's neurotech. So thinking people's thoughts is actually coming up very, very quickly. I can't say that I'm excited about the prospect of analyzing this kind of data, but I definitely think that we need to be aware that in 2 years, this is a data source that's coming up for data scientists, because people are going to be accepting more and more to have technologies that are going to read their brains and their thoughts and so on. And so we need to think about how to respond to that. I'll stop there.
That's terrifying. I'll do this quickly. So both is my answer to your question about, does the language reflect or drive peace? And yes, it does both. We don't know whether it's a lagging indicator or a leading indicator yet. We're just not sure. But ultimately, what we believe is that the state and economy and the sort of elements in language that are about order and control are oftentimes existing in peaceful societies. And so people are afforded the time to think and play and be home and right. So it is the ratio that we're looking at, because when societies tighten up, the focus has to be on order, and they just don't have the bandwidth to focus on the other things. So what we're hoping to do is track the ratio and how the ratios change over time. I do want to say, just in terms of disinformation, what I have been able to identify is that there is the capacity to, I think, pretty accurately identify bot behavior in social media. So that's one of the drivers of a lot of this. It's a more efficient model, and if you can identify that, you can assume where that's coming from. Is language used to prepare communities for war and peace? Yeah. So one of the research that hasn't yet or is beginning to be applied to AI is called integrated complexity, and it's the degree to which language in political speeches is sort of both nuanced and provides context, or is sort of simplified and is really focused on action, because high integrative complexity is both. You provide context, and what they find with leaders is as nations move towards war, their language becomes simplistic, much more simple, low integrative complexity. So that is actually, I have a PhD student working on that right now, working on with AI on Reddit data. But so yes, we do conceptually understand that, and AI is moving into that. I can talk to you about our data sources, and yeah, I too am excited about, well, so the Internet of Everything, right? The Internet of Things is all the sensors that we'll have on, many of you probably have Fitbits. So we're now collecting your data, right? And can feed that back to you. So I do think the connection between biophysical data, political data, and then the social dynamics and the different cultural dynamics will help us just better understand the human condition. So I think there's all kinds of power there, but it's also terrifying.
Thank you. Thank you for your great questions. And this is our panel. Thank you, panelists.
Huh? Excellent. Could have been a whole day on